Thank you so much for joining us today. We've had record numbers of signups for this webinar. If you don't know Wordnerds, Wordnerds is a customer feedback and analytics platform that has been dealing in the housing industry for 2 or 3 years now. We run these webinars regularly. We've never had so much demand for one. So obviously we've either Chris is the biggest draw as a guest in the history of our webinars, or we've hit on a red button issue, and you can decide which of these two things it is. So my name is Pete Dagan. I am CEO of Wordnerds. I'm joined today by Steve. Steve is our Chief Scientific Officer. He is either the world's tallest linguist or the world's most pedantic giant. I will let you decide which one of those two he is. More importantly, we're joined by Chris Haynes. Chris is Head of Customer Insights at the Guinness Partnership. Chris, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us today. Full disclosure, Chris is also a Wordnerds customer, and we invited him on today because we see people at vastly different sides of the spectrum in terms of maturity, data maturity here. And certainly Chris is very definitely towards the more mature side of these things. Some of the things that Chris and the Guinness Partnership are doing with their tenant satisfaction measures and customer data generally is, I think, really interesting and exciting. So the idea is inviting Chris on, and he's very kindly agreed to share some screenshots and share some information about what those guys are doing to make sense of some of this TSM stuff. So the agenda for the next kind of 55 minutes of your lives, we're going to have a very quick run through of the TSM's timeline and what, as insights professionals and data analysts, you will have to do in advance of the 30th of June deadline. We're going to run a quick poll looking at where everybody is. We know even just amongst our clients in housing, different registered providers are at different stages. Some people have got their house in order on this. Some people already haven't. That's fine. There's still plenty of time. There's still plenty of time to turn it around. It's a bit like exams. My daughter's going through GCSEs right now, and it feels like the same kind of pressure. We're then going to do the kind of ask the analyst thing. So both Steve and Chris are analysts working in data in this area every day. I want to know specifically from them about the TSM system and is it any good? It is at its heart a quant number that you have to report. So how do you move that number? How do you make sense of it? What can you do to bring that number to life and affect it? I think that will probably be the bulk of the discussion. And then talking about things that we can do to prepare ourselves for the 30th of June. What does a good score look like? What do you do if your score isn't very good? There's a bunch of topics that we want to cover there. At the end of all that, we're going to do a quick Q&A. We will try and keep as much time as possible for that. You've already found the chat function for weather reports. Thank you so much. If you can also use that at any stage in proceedings to ask questions, I will endeavour to read them out, interrupt people with the things that you want to know. I promise you this works much better as dialogue than monologue, so please do get involved. And full disclosure, again, we have been known to ask people to come up and speak if they ask particularly insightful, pertinent, or mysterious questions. So be careful what you wish for. And then at the end, we'll do the usual kind of follow-up and talk about how we can help you and our plea for feedback. So I assume that as nobody has left already, that is an acceptable way for you all to spend the next hour of your lives. And with that, we're going to whistle through the intro to this, which is really what you need to do before the deadline. So 30th of June is the TSM deadline. That feels like a long time away. We've only just gone through New Year and it's the start of the year. But as we all know, June will be on us like that. It's not actually that far. And also, as we know in the last couple of weeks, the Ombudsman has also announced that the 30th of June is also the deadline for the complaint handling code. We're not dealing with that in this webinar. This webinar is specifically about TSMs. We will be doing a subsequent webinar on the complaint handling code and a similar thing to that. So if you like this webinar, feel free to sign up for that. If you don't, there's already an hour of your life that we've given you back. Aren't we generous? So that's the deadline. We know it's coming. there's a bunch of information out there. I'm sure you've seen all of the various bits and pieces in the standard and the guidance notes. We're not going to take you through that in detail. What we've done is gone through something a bit more useful and a bit easier to understand, which is the 5 things that, as data professionals and insights analysts in housing associations and registered providers, you must have done by the 30th of June. And I'm sure you know all of this, so apologies if this is granny sucking eggs territory. But number 1, you must have surveyed your residents. Number 2, you need to have broken down the results of that survey into 5 levels of satisfaction across 12 perception measure areas. So that's that little grid on the right-hand side, the very satisfied to very dissatisfied in each of the different sort of TP areas, the perception areas. More on that in a moment. Number 3, you need to calculate your score, which we'll go through how you do that, and provide contextual information to aid in interpretation of that. That feels like pretty open-ended. Hopefully Chris can talk to us a little bit about some of the things that he's doing to bring that to life. Number 4, we're going to publish the results and inform and all of the information relating to your survey approach. So you need to talk about the channels that you used, how, what times of day you did it, how many people you talked to, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, number 5, you need to upload supporting documentation. So any information about things that you haven't been able to do. So they're the 5 big things that you need to do. That's kind of it in a nutshell between now and the 30th of June. Sounds simple, right? Just out of interest, I mentioned that we were going to do a poll. I'm hoping that Kelton has, there it is now. Kelton's just popped on screen a little poll. We can't tell who's saying what, so feel free to be completely honest. We'd love to find out where you are in this process. Speaking to various of our customers and people we're talking to, we've already seen people at lots of different stages of the process, from haven't started all the way through to results published. So please do fill that in. Looking like a lot of people in the collecting data phase, which is great. Quite a few people in the data analyze stage as well, which is wonderful. And everywhere in between. That's quite a good spread. Chris and Steve are the analysts, but that's looking like, yeah, it's bell curvy to me. I'm liking that. Normal distribution, gentlemen. So this is great news. Great. Okay, so moving on from that. So we know what we need to do. I guess this is an Ask the Analyst session. So I think my first question is this a good system? And I think, Steve, can I pick on you first? Can you talk to us a little bit about how the TSM is calculated and what the implications are for housing associations, please?
Absolutely. Yeah, the calculation of a score is very much right in my nerdy wheelhouse, so I think you'll have to kick me under the virtual table if I start going on a bit too long. Is this a good score? I think first it's important to say that there is no perfect way of coming up with one score from a 5-star rating system. Every way in which people do it, from MPS to CSAT, they all have flaws. There are challenges with all of them. So I think the question is not, have they chosen a good system here? I think the question is, what does this system mean for you when you're looking to both deliver your score and also to improve your score in future? Very briefly, because I'm sure most of you are aware of this, the way in which they calculate the TSM score is they take your very satisfied and fairly satisfied responses. They take that, they put that into one pot. They then divide that number by all of your responses, excluding NA and don't know. So it's that little group at the top divided by everything. And that's how you get to your TSM score number, which is a really interesting way of approaching this. And as I say, there's no perfect way of doing it, but there are some specific things here that I think it's worth being aware of when you're thinking about improving your score. The first is looking at the neutral responses. This system, because there's 2 pots, there's your very satisfied, fairly satisfied, and then everything else, that means that your neutral scores are counted in exactly the same way as your very negative scores. Your worst detractors are counted in exactly the same way as people who don't know much about you. And I think that's a really specific and really interesting challenge. You obviously have to be aware of the people who are in the kind of the very dissatisfied camp, because that's where a lot of your complaints will come from. So understanding the subset, excuse me, the subset of people who are very dissatisfied that are then likely to that are having a kind of issue that is likely to result in a complaint is really important. But the other key area that you need to look at in order to understand where your TSM score is likely to go is that threshold, that inflection point between neutral and fairly satisfied. That's the jump that is most likely to occur. There are obviously jumps that come from other places in it as well. You will get people going from very positive to very negative and so on. But when you get a chance to look at this over time, and perhaps you have star surveys and stuff that you can use as an analog for this, when you're looking at over time, look at what is pushing people over that threshold, because that threshold is the inflection point that will ultimately be the thing that will affect your score more than anything else. So in answer to your initial question, Pete, it's it's one of many ways that you can select a number out of this. It's not better or worse than the other, but there are specific flaws and challenges with it that are really interesting to think about when you're looking at how to improve your TSM.
Thanks, Steve. And Chris, from your perspective, what does this mean for a housing association? Where might we see some of those issues with neutrals being bad and some of these other things that Steve's pointed out?
Yeah, so I'd say, firstly, no, I'd rather have this scale than NPS. I think it's a scale which, for better or worse, a lot of housing companies were already using for satisfaction. So at least we've got some continuity in terms of overall satisfaction. But yeah, I agree. The fundamental weak spot with this scale is that the indifferent get lumped together with the furious. So that's very clear. They're equally failures because they fall outside the satisfied. But to answer your question, I think it appears more acutely in the homeowner results. So I find there's less neutrals in the renter results because, for the most part, someone's been into their home and done something for them, which they might have a view on for positive or negative reasons. For homeowners, we find, certainly looking through the comments, a lot are saying, well, I don't really have much to do with Guinness. And they might pay a very small service charge for some quite modest communal services. So we see a lot more neutrals within their scores. And obviously, if they're neutral and they're not satisfied according to this rating scale, and so perhaps our scores make them look more unhappy than they actually are. So that's where I'd be advising to look for the effects of the scale.
Interesting. Yeah, it's the law of unintended consequences. Very interesting. All right, great. So it might be a good system, it might not be a good system, but it is the system that we've got, so we deal with it anyway. And that brings me to my second question. This is one that we get reflected back at us. Fundamentally, TSMs is a number or a series of 14 numbers, one in each area. And that presents a challenge, a similar challenge to NPS or CSAT or some of these other measures. The biggest question we get outside of housing is, my CSAT score is going up or down. I don't know why. How can I find out? And I think the same question can be asked about TSMs. This number is going to go up or down. How do you understand why it's going up or down? How do you contextualize it? How do you change it? And Chris, perhaps you can talk us through some of the ways that you're dealing with this kind of data at Guinness, because I think you're doing some pretty interesting things.
Yeah, so I would say there's probably two answers to a question at the top of this slide. And the first one would be that I would strongly recommend doing some key driver or regression analysis of your results to see which of the underlying TSM metrics have most leverage and overall satisfaction. So we've done that based on our scores. We found that the key drivers are maintenance of the building, listens and acts, and treats fairly and with respect, if I can read the very small font there. So those are our top three. And we found that some other TSM metrics perhaps don't have as much leverage and overall satisfaction. So, for example, neighbour contribution question we find has very little impact on overall satisfaction based on those answers. So I think that allows us to give more precise and perhaps more interesting commentary from month to month, because we can concentrate on looking at those drivers rather than trying to describe 12 different scores and speculating on which of those might be causing our overall satisfaction to go up or down. And I think if you go on to the next build, I can't quite see the numbers there, but you'll see a sort of little tree in the bottom left-hand corner. So we did some what's called tree regression. The numbers you'll see in the little circles are the overall satisfaction scores based on the scores people gave to other questions in the survey. So basically, on 3 different questions, just using the listens and acts, just using the well-maintained home and were treated fairly in respect, and with respect, we can explain about an 80-point gap in overall satisfaction just using those 3 questions and people's responses to them. So we've got a 12-question questionnaire, but actually you can explain huge differences in overall satisfaction just using 3 of them based on that regression analysis we did. So that would be another way we look at contextualizing the results, understanding them. And obviously at the bottom part of that, we will look into the verbatims as well. So as an example, I've said listens and acts is a key driver of TSMs. That sounds very much like a sort of communication and consultation type question. But when we dig into the verbatims of people who don't feel that we listen and act, often it's not about communication, it's more about the customer feeling we're not on top of the things that need to happen in their home. So it does sort of snake back to the actual property and less about communication, which is what the question on face value would suggest. So those are some examples of the driver analysis we've done so far to give some context.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? That there's a mismatch between the question that you're surveying about and the results of what people tell you in response to that question. And actually, sometimes I imagine that you've got drivers for different of your TSM scores in the wrong pot.
That's correct. Another point I should make about driver analysis as well. When you do this sort of analysis, all you're looking at is the questions that are within the questionnaire as it stands. There may be other drivers which are not asked at the moment in TSM. So for example, we add an extra question about grounds maintenance because we believe that to be a driver of overall satisfaction, but that's not something that's being covered by the TSM questionnaire. I know some other providers are adding a customer effort question as well because they found that to be useful in understanding overall satisfaction. So this regression analysis, it tells you within the TSM questionnaire as it stands what drives overall satisfaction, but you might want to consider adding your own questions if you think the TSM questionnaire is missing stuff out.
That's really
sorry, just to add to that, because you're absolutely right. We do see additions. The other addition that we see quite a lot with our customers when we're adding putting in categories to break up the data is value for money. We get people looking at rent and service charges and that kind of thing that aren't directly addressed within the questions that you have to ask for the TSMs, but are obviously another good indicator of. But again, as Chris said, the other areas that he's mentioned are also really useful for that.
Yeah, I should say we also add value for money for our shared owners as well, because we find we send out service charge letters twice a year, and we will see that drop down and usually a little bump in our overall satisfaction downwards around the time we send those letters. So it's useful to be able to calibrate that seasonality based on when we sort of send people a bill.
Fantastic, thank you. And that the stuff you've shown there, Chris, is your kind of board reports that you send out in a kind of static format every month or whenever, however often your board things are. But there's also an element of what you do that's kind of always on dashboarding. Do you want to just talk us through some of that stuff as well, please?
Yeah, so my preferred way of producing results is to, and I know not everyone has the luxury of doing this because their format is constrained either by what tools they have available in house or what formats board reports are required in. But my preference is always the sort of dashboard style with many charts compressed into a single page. Most of our reports, which we do in this way, run to about 3 or 4 pages. If I did them in PowerPoint, they might be like 30 to 40 slides. So our process really is when we get new data, we point to our existing dashboards, which run through a BI tool called Tableau, to a new data. All the fresh data is automatically inserted into our charts. So the next point in the timeline or the next point in the data table, year-to-date scores are automatically updated and calculated. What we find then is it gives us a lot more time, which would otherwise be spent typing in new numbers into PowerPoint and checking we've typed them incorrectly, to actually think about the data, thinking about whether we could sort of visualize it in a different way. I've got this little one-pager from our transactional survey for responsive repairs. It's a very simple questionnaire. So we ask 2 questions, one overall satisfaction, one about the engineer, and then any comments. So we will track that in line charts. But what we try and bring in is as much operational data as well as possible to give context. So outside the scope of the survey, we will look at satisfaction by trade, but the turnaround time for each of those trades and see if there is a connection with that and the satisfaction that the customer has, which there inevitably is for appointable jobs. And if you move on to the next build, Pete, thanks. We can look at things such as subcontractor as well, if we have subcontracted it to someone local. And that's when we would also bring in perhaps the verbatims as well, and we would have a look at if there is anything perhaps a bit more unusual, other than being nice about the engineer or being negative about time taken, for example. And I think on this one, we actually had mental health pop up as a category as well. Sometimes because the services we were providing with someone with disability or mental health issues, but sometimes it comes up in a way that they express dissatisfaction and the stress that it might have caused them as well. So it's just an example of one of the unusual topics that can come up. And if you go on to the final build of this one, this is just a bit of eye candy really, but what I quite like to do when I have multiple metrics is to sort of smash them together and produce a single index score. So this is basically smashing together the engineer score and the overall satisfaction score, looking at it by trade, and basically 100 will be our worst performing based on that metric, and then the scores become increasingly green and more satisfied on that index as the customers become more satisfied on those 2 metrics smashed together. So basically we're doing very well on electrical work and plumbing there in our transactional survey. So that's really the house style for our reports. We try and focus on quite concise, pretty BI dashboards where we can automate a lot of the updating and then concentrate on commentary and try and drag other information in. You're muted, Pete.
Oh, I can't believe I did that. Classic. So firstly, we love a bit of data eye candy, and we love people that smash together data as well. This is right up our street, Chris. I think it would be remiss of me not to point out that for that kind of topic analysis bit, that's the bit that you use the Wordnerds platform for, isn't it? You kind of bring some of that data in from Wordnerds. And I think just to your point about the link between the quant and the qual, I think one of the things that, again, a question we get all the time is, you've done a great job here of turning things into easy to understand numbers with nice colors behind them, so that stupid people in higher up in the organization, in executive teams and CEO seats, can understand things at a glance. But often it's the selecting bits of verbatim or adding the bits of color around a number that really brings an item to life or a problem to life. And it's the verbatim that people remember kind of 5 or 6 months after, and it's not the figure. Do you want to talk a bit about how you select that, or kind of how you get that balance right between the quant and the qual reporting?
Yeah, I guess if I didn't have any verbatim analysis, what essentially I would be doing each month is basically explaining one number in terms of other numbers in the survey. So even with that fancy regression analysis, I'd still be saying, well, it's gone down because of the score has gone down here and here and here. But I guess one of the examples would be on that listens and acts, which is a driver, by looking at the verbatims and picking out lots of examples of people who weren't satisfied with that. We could basically prove that it wasn't so much about consultation or communication, but it was actually about something else. There was something else in those verbatims that allowed us to understand what was moving that measure up and down, and it wasn't the thing that you would think of just based on the way the question is worded. I would say also, I'm looking for little micro issues that I can investigate in more detail as well. A practical example would be, and it wasn't from our survey, but I noticed when I was going through customer complaints and CRM cases that a couple of customers had mentioned that they believed ivy and creeping plants that hadn't been cut back was causing their ventilation to block, and that was causing damp and mold. So what I could do using Wordnerds, where I've got everything basically being smashed up together in there, was go through all of our surveys, any complaints that I happened to push through the platform as well, create my own little category for ivy and creeping plants, identify every single comment which mentioned it, which was quite a bit more than 2 when I actually looked them all up, and then I could start to cross-reference that against our own records of damp and mold and our own risk models of damp and mold, and start to see if there was actually a connection, which tentatively I think there might be, because I can see slightly higher incidence when I look at people who've had a topic hit on those. So yeah, it's those little micro issues which make the commentary more interesting, but also might lead to little follow-up pieces of analysis which might tell us something which we don't already know.
I mean, be still my beating heart. I love everything about this process. This is exactly the way that this should be done, and really, really interesting. Thanks for that, Chris. Like I said right at the start, different housing associations are wildly different in terms of scale and resources. Chris, the stuff that you're doing is extremely advanced, I think, compared to what we see across the market. Steve, if you're a housing association coming to this that feels maybe a little bit intimidated by that level of statistical competence and understanding, can you talk to us a bit about what other options there are for you and other perfectly acceptable, helpful ways of doing this on a more easily accessible scale?
I mean, I am just so delighted that Pete started talking while on mute, because every single other webinar we've ever done together, at some point I've done that, and I'm just absolutely giddy that it was Pete that did it this time. So let me just compose myself for a second. Yeah, so I think what Chris has just shown us, obviously, it's so impressive and it's so kind of well thought through. It's always on. It allows you to see that how you go about enacting change in a really visually interesting and a really accessible way. There are lots of steps between what Chris is doing and other kind of approaches. And if Chris's approach does feel a little bit kind of intimidating to some of you, that's completely fine. I think that, you know, whether you're doing what Chris is doing with using BI tools and that kind of thing, or you are writing out reports that you're going to be passing around to your senior leadership team, your goal is still the same. Your goal is still to answer 3 kind of main questions about your TSMs, and those questions are, first of all, see what was your score, the what of the situation, the quantitative numbers that you've got from that. Why was that your score? Is the second part. Why did you get that score? And what are you going to do about it? And I think you'll have seen in Chris's work that there's this very clear through line going from one to the other, going from this is the quantitative what we scored. This is the situation as it stands. This is why that happened, and this is what we're going to do about it. And the example Chris gave with the ivy is a really great example of that process. What we found at Wordnerds with our reporting is things get better the closer you can pool those three things together. So in the kind of standard TSM report that we've been looking to, that some of our customers have been using, that we based the data you're looking at now, by the way, is synthesized data. It is data that we've created through a generative AI tool. But the kind of, this is the idea that a lot of our customers are kind of currently looking at. This is the first page of that report. And hopefully what you can see from this is we've got the what, we've got the numbers, the quantitative stuff to help you understand within each of your areas what your score was, what portion of the comments that you got were about that issue, were about that area, how that's changing over time, how that is comparing to benchmarks that we do. But then right next to it, you've got why that happened. So the subcategories within that main category that have changed. And then these are the things that we want to do about it. So that's the first page of most of our reports. It also acts as a little contents page you see on the far side there. But I think the key thing that we think about in terms of our reports is that gives your senior leadership team the most outdoorsy and hard to get to focus CEO in the country, will be able to look at that at a glance and understand it. This page essentially is the report. The next 20 pages or so are one long appendix attached to the report. But you need to be able to demonstrate, you need to prove what you're showing here. So we then go down into sort of a deeper dive into each process. So firstly, we'll look at the proportion of the comments that are talking about specific things in specific subcategories. So going from that high level, we scored this in repair, which is not something you can do about. Going down to, we got a problem, we seem to have an issue with damp and mold, going down to this damp and mold seems to have been caused by ivy. And those kind of steps, and that is something that you can action. That's something you can go and do something about, which is the pivotal thing that you're trying to do here. You need to show the numbers though, because that is how you can demonstrate, you can provide the evidence base for what the challenges are. So we do a breakdown of categories, subcategories within each of the TSM categories. Looking at benchmarking, looking at what are the most positive and negative, the most commonly discussed subcategories within it. At that next stage, we then go to look at why that particular subcategory was an issue, and also where it was an issue and for whom was it an issue. So this is an example in safety and security. You'll looking at what is the common language within the people who are who have this issue, and looking also at metadata around it. You'll have seen that again in Chris's work. He went into contractors, into you might have particular regions where this is an issue. You might have particular types of home where this is an issue. And so getting a sense, and then finding the key subcategories that where there seems to be problems, and then looking at, well, where is this happening and who is this happening to? And then the final stage, again, Pete and Chris spoke about this already, but finding verbatims that sum up that issue is a really important and valuable part for all that, you know, we are data nerds and we love to see pretty graphs. The thing that will get this across to your senior leadership team, to other people in the organization that you need to understand what's going on, is to bring back in the human, to bring back in, to go from this at the top level is the problem with the score. This is why this is happening. Here's an example of a human being that's being affected by it. And once you've got that through line, you have everything you need in order to enact change. And ultimately, the point of the reporting that you're doing is to enact change to your TSM score, yes, but mainly to your customers' lives. Again, this is how we go about reporting this stuff. There are obviously, as Pete said, different levels and different scales of whether you're just reading through your comments and picking stuff out, whether you're doing something with a BI tool, whether you're using artificial intelligence to do it. The goal remains the same, to get those three questions. What's your score? Why was that the score? What are you going to do about it?
And we're sending this out to everybody who's on this call today. We're going to send them the example report so they can see how this works across the whole suite of perception measures.
Absolutely. Please forgive the slightly strange comments, by the way. That is because we're using synthetic data. So we've tried a lot with ChatGPT to get to write as regular housing customers would, and we get a lot of things like this. I was pleasantly surprised by the professionalism. And if we don't do it that way, if we say, can you be more informal, we get a lot of, yo, man, this professionalism of the electrician is dope. We find it hard to get a balance, but hopefully it'll give you a sense of the kind of thing that we do with real comments. And yeah, as you say, Pete, that'll be in your care package. Now, you'll probably notice that we skipped quite an important stage there, which is how you go about actually categorizing the data. Again, there's lots of different ways of doing that. So I said, you've got your categories, then you've got your subcategories. There's lots of different ways of approaching this problem. There are so many issues, again, it's such a great example that Chris gave, the ivy over the grate that's causing that. You can't go through, you can't know in advance what all these issues are going to be. So we have been training up AI to do that for us. We call it the Wordnerds theme bank, which basically breaks the data down into 5 main categories around the TSMs, which are based on the TSM, the 12 TSM categories. And underneath that, we then have subcategories that go into more depth on the specific challenges that are an impact in each of those. So for example, at the first column, repairs, which obviously is a key element of customer satisfaction and of the TSMs. We've broken that down into a kind of a journey going from setting of the appointment to how the contractor was, to the work that they did, to the outcome of that work, and then the perception of the customer around it. We've done that through the training of an AI. Again, there are lots of different ways of approaching that. You can tag the data yourself. You can use a kind of keywording thing. So when they mention a particular word, it falls into a particular box. But the goal, again, remains the same, to try and break down these big nebulous concepts into slicing it into categories that will then allow you to figure out, again, why did you get that score and what are you going to do about it?
Great, thanks, Steve. And good to see some cross-cutting themes there that Chris mentioned as well. We've certainly got things that we tend to get out of the data that aren't in the TSMs, because we find, to Chris's point about regression analysis, that they do drive satisfaction as well, and you'll see them in the top right-hand corner. And again, we'll give you the full list of things that we listen for in our Wordnerds theme bank in an email after this, and feel free to rip that off and use that to give you inspiration for your own categorization, if that's helpful. All right, great. So moving on, I think that's a really, really interesting and hopefully useful exploration of how you can do more than just report these numbers and bring these numbers to life, understand them, and begin to kind of change them. I think for me then, the next question is then, okay, so what happens on the 30th of June? Because from my perspective, I guess that everybody's going to publish their scores. There will be one person who's top of the league table, and everybody else is to some extent a loser. Everybody else, their CEO is going to turn around and go, right, we want to be higher than them. We want to be higher than we are. How do we get our score up? So I guess my question is then, as insights people dealing with this, as data analysts looking at this stuff, firstly, how do we know if we've got a good score? And what do we do if the score isn't what we'd like it to be? Because to some extent, our number is our number, and there's nothing we can do in the short term to change that. So, Chris, can I bring you back in? How would you go about answering those questions?
So hopefully most of the people on the call, if they're going to be submitting TSMs, would have had access to some benchmarking data now, either through their agency or perhaps informally. I've seen some benchmarking data done by our agency, Leadership Factor, which was done anonymously, obviously, among around 50-ish providers. In terms of what average looks like, I guess, for the renters, it's looking like late 60s, early 70s is around the middle of the distribution. I would say there's quite a long tail on the sort of negative side of it. So perhaps a few outliers with quite low scores. I haven't seen anything really above 80, 85. That seems to be the top of it. For homeowners, it's looking at late 40s, early 50s is around par, but quite wide variation in that one. What I would say is when I see a low score, I don't think, well, whoever that is must be poor. I'm thinking, right, where do they operate? Are the regions in which they operate more difficult than mine? Are the high scorers operating in regions which are much easier than Guinness operate in? So I would take those, any sort of league table with a bit of pinch of salt. I'm also interested in the sort of methodology they're using as well, because that could influence the scores. What I would say as well is, based on some fairly reliable intelligence, I would say I think the regulator is probably going to be less interested in what people's scores are at the end of year one, but is going to be looking with quite a lot of rigor into how that score is being calculated and what methodology is being used. So I think they will probably be checking for compliance and doing a lot of grilling of people on that, rather than getting on the backs of people who might be low down the league table. That's my understanding based on what I've heard anyway.
Fantastic. That's really useful to know. And thanks for sharing those scores with us as well. I think it's inevitable whenever you put a number on something that people are going to compare these things. I think for all of the reasons that you say, that is folly, but it is, like GCSE results or anything else, it is unfortunately how people will do these things. And I think that leads us to another thing as well, which is that, there is a temptation with these things that all of our jobs become about getting a better score. And clearly that's a trap. Clearly the thing that we need to be doing is improving outcomes for residents, giving people the best possible quality homes to live in, and the best experience of our organizations. And I know that there is a big drive from the community not to let the score kind of dominate things. Steve, what's your take on this? Well, I think inevitably, for the reasons we've said, all eyes will be on insights professionals in housing associations for the next few months. What's your advice to those people?
Yeah, it's a really interesting little paradox there. I think we were talking about this the other day, Pete, and we were kind of saying, this must be a nerve-wracking time for people in insights teams in housing associations, because, as you say, you're going to get this score. You are going to there's going to be one that's at the top. Everyone else is going to be looking around going, why weren't we higher? You're going to have your whole senior leadership team wanting to understand how it could be better, and they're all going to be looking at you. But I think embedded within that is this enormous opportunity. Everybody in your housing association, your whole senior leadership team, from the CEO on down, are going to be looking at you. And that is a huge opportunity to enact the change that you know needs to happen in your housing association. The score does give you this. If you do have a score obsessed CEO or senior leadership team, that can be annoying, but it can also be a huge opportunity if you can quickly get them an action plan for these are the things that we need to do in order to improve our TSMs in future. So I think that kind of key, that issue that might be causing some people to feel worried about the 30th of June. If you have been through the process of extracting from the data what you think needs to happen, there will be momentum behind that to enact change after the 30th of June. Sorry, Pete's just put up the what we call the Wordnerds feedback framework. This is about how you create a feedback strategy that will allow you to continue to improve upon the lives of your customers. You can see within that you've got these sort of two little loops in the middle. You've got insight, which is a lot of the stuff that we've talked about, how you go about measuring the various different challenges, how you go prioritizing, how you report that to your organization. You've then got this impact side of designing what you think the solution should be. And that's something you do as an organization, testing it, and if it works, scaling it. There's never going to be a better time to start to look at that impact side of because there will be, there's likely to be a situation where your hires up are worried about their score. They're thinking about what are we going to do about this. So if you have the action plan, if you have got this through line going from this is what the score was, this is why we got that score, and this is what we think should be done about it to make our customers' lives better so they will score us better next time. That's the thing for me that is really exciting about what's going on, despite the fact that there is obviously a lot to do before the 30th of June. And I think for me, that's the exciting bit. I totally agree with Chris that I think that ensuring that everyone is marking according to the same scale, understanding how people got their data, and so any information you can give about your methodology and I think that that's true of the analysis as well. That's true of this is how we're going to use this information in order to make our customers' lives better. That's the kind of thing that regulators generally love. So I think that as well is something worth looking at, as well as the kind of stuff you do in order to get that score. Understanding and explaining to the regulator what you're going to do with that score is also, I think, a really important thing to look at. You have the opportunity to give supporting information. They've encouraged you to give anything that you think helps them to understand your score. So I think as well as ensuring that the survey process and all the stuff you've had to do before that was according to the standards that they expect, looking at this is what we want to do with that to make it better, I think is also something that you should be looking at.
Perfect. Great. Thank you for that, Steve. I love the positive reframing of a high pressure situation into an opportunity for insights analysts. That's very glass half full of you. Well done. All right, great. We are bang on time. We've got just over 10 minutes left. And I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions for Chris and Steve. So please, if you've got anything you want to ask, whack it in the chat now. I guess while we're waiting for some questions to come through, Chris, is there anything from what Steve said that you kind of want to double back on, or anything that we've kind of missed in the conversation that you think it's useful for people to know?
I just wanted to mention our hot alerts because it sort of reflects a bit in what do we do about the scores. So we have a live results portal, which is managed by our agency, Leadership Factor. Whenever they complete an interview, the scores are updated along with comments. And if a customer is dissatisfied and has given consent for us to recontact them, they will appear in our hot alert queue. We can click on their response. We can see what scores they gave. We can see their comments, and we can see their contact details. That queue is managed by our regional managers, and if it's an issue they feel they can resolve, they will recontact the customer. They will drop a note into that hot alert queue saying what they've done with a reference to a CRM case as well. And it's just a way of sort of, rather than waiting a year and then coming up with a strategy, we're sort of directly seeking to influence satisfaction on people who take the time to do our survey. So it's just another thing I wanted to mention.
Great. No, thank you for that. That is really helpful. We refer to that as the inner loop and the outer loop, the kind of the solving the issue for the one person and then going up the chain to look at solving it for everybody else as well. And I think that opportunity to kind of reclassify after you've been back is really useful, isn't it? Matt, thank you so much for your question. What additional questions did you ask in your TSM, Chris? If you did, I presume you did, to get the verbatim comments on listens to and acts.
Yeah, so for renting customers, we've got a grounds maintenance question as well. For homeowners, we've got a value for money question, again, on a 5-point scale to match all the others. And as you suggest, we've got some additional verbatim prompts in there as well, just to get a bit more detail on some of the coded scores.
Great. All right. Nicola's asked a question. I'm just trying to process this now while I'm talking.
So we asked for qualitative responses against every TSM just to understand what the important things were for people. And there's no movement away from the questions set down in the TSMs, is there? So even though they tried to tweak it to make it specific about building safety, the interpretation by residents was that building safety, they automatically thought about antisocial behaviour. We work in a city, high density area, so there is neighbour news. Everyone's on top of each other, and neighbour issues are huge. So the responses in terms of building safety, neighbourhood management, everything kind of missed the mark. So the qualitative response, the verbatim responses are all ASB focused, which is interesting. And hopefully we can feed that back to the regulator. So it wasn't a question, just an observation.
It's interesting. What are you going to do about it? Because I guess that's not something that you've got a great deal of control over.
No, it's difficult, isn't it? I guess it's building understanding about the TSMs so that next time when we're asking, people will kind of compartmentalize their thinking. And also just a comm strategy through various ways around what we do around antisocial behaviour and how we respond to it, so that to build awareness.
It's go on.
Sorry, Pete. It's a really interesting challenge, Nicola. And I think I wonder whether it's worth just thinking about this. Maybe well be something that you've tried, but for as a general rule for other people that are having similar challenges, I'm wondering whether part of the problem is the fact that the antisocial behaviour and the neighbourhood management questions are quite close to the end of the survey, if you do them just in order from 2 to 12. And so if you have a significant burning issue with antisocial behaviour, you're likely to put it into the first one which will be building safety, because it seems to be the one that because it's the first time that there's a question that you can bring to that. And if that's the thing that's on your mind, that's going to be coming out first. I'd be interested to see, and I'm not sure if this would be possible, but I'd be interested to see if you were to move the question on antisocial behaviour to earlier on in the survey. What you might find is people then have the opportunity to express their discomfort with those issues, and then you might find that the subsequent questions, because they've already had the opportunity to answer that, they may then have they may then kind of start to think about other things outside the prism of antisocial behaviour. If you're having specific problems with that, if you know that that's something that people are likely to be talking about a lot, the guidance says that you have to ask them where that might well be true, and I'm so sorry if that's the case. As a general rule in surveys, that can be a useful way if you know you're going to get something, get them to say it first off. But
has Chris looked into results around complaints handling? And yes, to C's point about moving SB question, it'd be good if it could be moved. Thank you, Jeremy. Chris?
Yes, we have. And unlike most providers who've looked at this, we find people who say they've made a complaint in the survey, when we cross-reference it against our records, haven't made a formal complaint. So they're basically saying there was something about which I was unhappy at some point in the year, but it's not necessarily a formal complaint, as the question sort of implies. So my conclusion from that would be, if they give a low score on complaints handling, it's not entirely the problem of your complaints team. They're just saying there was something about which they were unhappy earlier in the year, and they're feeding back on that rather than the complaints team.
Yeah, there's something interesting here in the definition of a complaint as well, which actually, if you look at the wording, includes people shouting at your officers as they drive past you in a car. So, there's definitely work to be done there. We're running out of time. Thank you so much to everybody who's asked a question. Nicola, thank you for coming on and explaining your comment as well. That was super helpful. Just very quickly, I'd like to just talk briefly about next steps. So as we've said, after this webinar, we're going to send you the slides from today, a recording of the session if you want to point anybody else in your organization at it. We're going to send Steve's example, the synthetic TSM report, to give you some slides that you can rip off for your own reporting and some inspiration about how you might report that information as well, or as an example of the kind of thing that Wordnerds can help you with. We'll also give you the list of categories in the TSM theme bank. I think the only other thing I would say is, we are on a ticking clock here. As I said at the start of this process, June the 30th will be here before we all know it. We're getting more and more housing associations getting in touch as we get closer to the deadline. We are delighted to help with any part of this. That can be informal help, advice and chats and conversations, which we're always happy to give, or it can be formal paid for help. We do offer a fully managed TSM survey report where we can take your survey data, do the kind of analysis that Chris was talking about, and build those reports for you. So if you are behind, speak to us about that. That can be a one-off. The other thing we can do is we can look at an ongoing process of building out the data so that you can do the driver analysis as well. So raise your hand, speak to us if you want to talk about that. We'd be really happy to help. There is no obligation to do that, of course. The one thing we do have an ask of you is we are always staggered that so many of you continue to turn up to these webinars. We love your feedback. We love to know what was helpful, what wasn't, what hit the mark, what did we miss out. Sarah pictured there, who is soon to be going on maternity leave. So depending on how long she has left, she'll be following up, asking you guys for your feedback. We would really appreciate any steer you can give us. And even when she goes away, I might pick up that job as well. So all that remains for me to say is thank you so much, Chris. It was really, really useful to see in detail the process that you've gone through. And I know that loads of other people on the call will have taken a lot from that. So thank you for being so generous and sharing that. Steve, thanks very much for your insights as well, as ever. It's super helpful. Guys, thank you to all of you that turned up today. Have a great rest of the day. It's 3 o'clock. We'll let you all go.